Howdy doody folks, and welcome back to our journey across the United States. Today we're visiting Washington State, which might be about the strangest state I've covered in this saga so far. Today we have stories from the 1920s about Bigfoot, we have the origin of the Men in Black and flying saucers, and even a story about a bank heist that, depending on who you are, might put D.B. Cooper to shame. Anyhow, quickly, here at T Storytime, we're aiming for 1 million subs, which might be ambitious, and as of recording now, we're a hot 870,000 away. However, if you want to help me grow, the best thing you can do for me is like this video, subscribe, and comment. It's the quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. Anyhow, with that, let's explore some of Washington's weirdest lore. Flying saucers, the Men in Black, and more. Sure, these things are pervasive in pop culture today, but did you know that their origins actually come from the state of Washington? And from the exact same case, pretty much, no less. They're a little bit different, but they're connected. In short, I thought I'd start off this video with a banger, with the Maury Island incident, the origin of so much of the United States extraterrestrial folklore. This story begins on June 21st of 1947, when one of the most interesting events in all of Washington history would occur over the Puget Sound. On this day, a man from Tacoma, Washington, named Harold Dahl, was with his son, 2 workers, and his family dog aboard the North Queen, the family boat, upon which they planned to salvage logs from the Puget Sound. Aboard this ship, they traveled about 3 miles north from their origin point in Tacoma, Washington, to Maury Island. Now, no source talks about how much work they actually got done before this happened, but my impression is that soon after their arrival, I quote, flying discs would appear over their heads, with 5 of them flying high, but 1 flying suspiciously low, as if it were having some sort of malfunction, whatever that would entail for a flying saucer. Either way, this craft would sort of spew molten material down onto the boat of Harold Dahl, and he described this debris as what seemed like thousands of newspapers from somewhere on the inside of its center. This debris would hit the boat, burning Dahl's son's arm, and sadly burning the family dog to the extent that it passed, which absolutely sucks, and for the record, aliens, I'd pretty much go to war with an extraterrestrial civilization if they touched my dog. You can pretty much do whatever you want to me, aliens. There are just 2 rules. 1, no probing, and 2, no touching toffee, or I will make your species extinct. Anyhow, leaving ET obliteration behind, this debris to Dahl resembled lava rocks, which were white and very light, and supposedly sort of fluttered their way down to Earth. Either way, even though the humans in this event survived, the saga was not over. The next morning, on June 22nd of 1947, a man that was, according to Dahl, wearing a black suit would knock on Dahl's home's door, and then he would bring Dahl to a Tacoma diner, asking him about the prior day's events. Dahl, of course, would oblige and tell him, and then the man would do what you've probably heard so many times in other Men in Black stories. He would threaten Dahl and make sure he knew that he was not to tell a soul about what he encountered. This man, too, would damage, somehow, the photos that Dahl had taken of the debris. From what I can tell, the memory-wiping tech that they show in the movies was not yet invented, though. Further, there's a sort of investigation component in this saga that's rarely talked about, or at least the OG BuzzFeed Unsolved guys didn't touch on it. But regardless, it is intimately linked to this saga. I was actually going to make this part of a separate story, but they're intimately connected, so I think I'll just share it here. To put this simply, this saga gets way more interesting if you examine its aftermath. While the Maury Island incident itself was the inciting event, or at least the first event, in the strange 1947 summer, dubbed the Summer of Saucers by many, in the days and weeks that followed, more well-known events occurred. This list is a greatest hits list of sorts, to be clear. Just 3 days after the Maury Island incident, one Kenneth Arnold would see 9 flying saucers near Mount Rainier, and about 2 weeks after this was the Roswell, New Mexico UFO crash, which I don't want to be sensational here, I try to be factual, but when you have a man, sort of out of nowhere, see flying discs and reputedly lose his dog to them just days before 2 of the most notable possible ET events in US history, it's hard not to look at this case with a magnifying glass. Anyhow, let's talk about that investigation. Linked to this event is that 3 days later, on June 24th of 1947, private pilot Kenneth Arnold reportedly saw a string of 9 shiny unidentified flying objects past Mount Rainier that he thought were going close to 1,200 miles an hour. This sighting and its subsequent reporting to media would result in the coining of the term flying saucer and flying disc for the first time, and further, Arnold would get in contact with the editor of the Amazing Stories magazine, admittedly often a hoax magazine, and together they'd actually coin the term unidentified flying object. This editor would then tell Arnold about this strange incident that occurred on Maury Island, and he would task Arnold with conducting an investigation of his own, wiring him about $200 or about $3,000 in 2025 money to accomplish this. Thus, Arnold would speak with one Captain E.J. Smith of United Airlines, who alongside his co-pilot and stewardess recently also witnessed strange flying objects in the Pacific Northwest, and then further he'd contact Lieutenant Frank Brown of Military Intelligence, 4th Air Force at Hamilton Field in California. This man would fly to Arnold's hotel in Tacoma, Washington, his sort of base of investigations where he was actually conducting this investigation, and he'd bring with him Captain William L. Davidson. Davidson and Brown together, alongside Arnold, would then interview locals, collect supposed fragments from this crash, and share their findings with one another. And then Captain William L. Davidson and Brown would prepare to return to California. And I should note, if you believe the story, they at least internally thought they had something. Not just a story, but supposedly they had tangible proof of whatever the strange debris was that the craft was dropping around Maury Island. As you might expect, though, Brown and Davidson never actually completed this trip. Rather, they crashed just outside of Kelso, Washington, both passing away. And while Arnold claimed that aboard this plane was the remnants of an extraterrestrial craft, the FBI claimed that all they found was scrap metal and a little bit of pumice stone from the Maury Island beach, and they later confirmed this through analysis at their labs. And as for what caused the crash, well, the U.S. Army claimed that it was simply due to an engine fire, plain and simple. Now, I don't want to make this sound akin to all that strange stuff going on with a certain Washington-based aerospace company, but I gotta say, this reminds me an awful lot of what's been happening to some aerospace company employees recently. Anyhow, this is another strange detail worth sharing, but in time there would be further weirdness. For one, Harold Dahl would come forward and claim to the world that what he recounted to them was a hoax, and thus, at least in the immediate future, this event just faded into obscurity. That said, I'm gonna say something I won't usually say on this channel. Despite Arnold saying this was a hoax, I think we should humor the idea of continuing to take the Maury Island incident a little bit seriously. See, the deeper you dig, the more it seems that Harold only said that the Maury Island incident was a hoax because he wanted the story to go away. Principally, I say this because while the FBI was actually inquiring about this case, the guy in charge, Jack Wilcox, wrote a very detailed record about what he did for 16 days in September of 1947, and in this writing he would explicitly note that Dahl saying this was a hoax was the real hoax. Dahl, on the record, would say to Jack, I quote, "Oh, I stand by what I say. I saw what I saw, but I'm now going to pretend I'm a liar, because that's an easier thing for me to live with than ridicule." This is the quote from the document that says this. I quote, "Dahl did not admit to redacted that his story was a hoax, but only stated that if questioned by authorities, he was going to say it was a hoax, because he didn't want any further trouble over the matter." Hoover, however, would basically say, "This is a hoax, close the case," even though Jack would argue otherwise. In short, many individuals think that Dahl simply said this is a hoax because that made the FBI, the supposed Men in Black, and even his wife happy. Further, though, there is another angle here that's worth keeping in mind if we want to, perhaps rightfully, cast a little bit of doubt. Remember, there were day workers involved here, according to Dahl. However, nobody, no FBI records or interviews, have ever confirmed who these men were. Further, Dahl's son Charles never spoke publicly about the incident, except for in one single interview where he would claim the whole thing was a hoax. Or at least that's what the initial print said. See, later, the journalist, the one that actually conducted the interview with Dahl's son, would claim that Charles was misquoted, and that Charles hadn't even claimed to him that this was a hoax, which is just so confusing. So was Charles telling the truth, keeping his family secret, or did the media deliberately misprint what he said? Anyhow, I encourage y'all, if you're interested, to read further into this saga, because to be honest, the Wikipedia page on the matter and most YouTube videos about this case stop before the real juicy details come out. And if you actually look into official reporting on this case, it gets a heck of a lot more nuanced. Now, am I saying absolutely an alien was flying north of Tacoma, Washington and dropping molten debris? Absolutely not. There's not nearly enough evidence to say so conclusively. But to say this is an outright hoax is far too simple of a claim based on the details we know about the case. Okay, I know this isn't a cryptids video, but I think I'd be a dang sociopath if I shied away from talking about what I think is one of the most interesting and fun Bigfoot stories that occurred before Bigfoot really entered the modern psyche like it has today. Plus, the Pacific Northwest is the Bigfoot capital of the world after all, so I think some hairy man lore is in order. Now, to set the scene for you, Ape Canyon is stunning and somewhat mysterious. It's a gorge located on the southern slopes of Mount St. Helens in Washington, about 40 miles north of the Washington-Oregon border and Portland. The canyon is filled with thick pine forests, but it's perhaps better known for its volcanic landscape, which was formed by ancient lava flows. This approximately 3-mile-long canyon is, to put it lightly, relatively rugged, and if you step off the trail, not only would the terrain be treacherous, but if you believe a strange 1924 article I'll be referencing, you might risk having a run-in with something that the miners of old in the region might have referred to as a brush ape. See, in the summer of 1924, a group of gold prospectors would stumble back into civilization after a clear, rough night out, but what they'd tell folks would forever change how people viewed the canyon. These men, Fred Beck, Gabe, John Peterson, Marion Smith, and Smith's son Roy, reportedly came upon, I quote, gorilla men near a cabin they'd built in the canyon to search for gold. In their story, they were about 8 miles from Spirit Lake, and they were prospecting a claim on the Muddy, a branch of the Lewis River, and here they would see 4 strange creatures like they'd never observed before. These creatures were about 7 feet tall, moving with, I quote, erect, human-like strides, and they were covered in black fur. Further, unlike the usual description of Bigfoot, they supposedly had 4-inch-long pointy ears on their head that stuck straight up, as well as 4 toes that were short and stubby. More on that detail later. By weight, they'd estimate these creatures were about 400 pounds, and they likened them to looking like gigantic gorillas that were standing on 2 legs. Of course, being good Americans, they couldn't just see something amazing like this and let it live. Rather, Beck would draw his revolver and fire at one of the creatures, using his Deadeye ability, I suppose, and managing to hit the creature 3 times, causing it to reel and then fall off a cliff. Of course, if he felled all 4 of these beasts, then maybe he'd have been safe, but in shooting one of their kin, well, rather than saving himself, he'd awoken the proverbial dragon. Later this evening, he'd learn just how bad he'd made his situation. See, while the men slept, in the middle of the night, they would wake up to the sounds of something crashing against their cabin. By their estimate, huge stones were being lobbed at the cabin. They, of course, supposed that those large apes, well, they were out for revenge. For hours this evening, large rocks crashed into their cabins, and some even came through a hole in the cabin's ceiling, crashing into the head of Fred Beck, which admittedly is deserving if this is true, and it supposedly knocked him unconscious for hours this evening. Of course, as with all monster stories, as the sun came above the horizon, the creatures would retreat back into the woods. With that, the men would take this opportunity to finally do the smart thing and make a hasty exit from the woods back to civilization, after which they'd tell this story and earn this canyon the name Ape Canyon. That said, these stories aren't exactly new for the area. They'd just gained a little bit more credence because, as far as I can tell, this posse of recreational prospectors was relatively well respected, unlike the previous folks that were telling of brush apes. Before these men, lumberjacks, hunters, and even other gold prospectors and miners had told stories for decades at this point of seeing large men in the woods, and that they'd occasionally find unusually large footprints in the snow and mud around Mount St. Helens. Canyons, and really all over the whole Pacific Northwest. Heck, even the natives of the region told stories of these creatures, referring to them as mountain devils. Again though, before this Ape Canyon saga, many just thought these creatures were nothing more than folklore, and some even suggested these creatures, if real, appeared friendly. This saga observed by these gold prospectors, though, would change the minds of the locals. Telling of their survival, which some dubbed as a battle with these Sasquatch-like beasts, they would incite a local investigation too, and the U.S. Forest Service would supposedly send out a couple of rangers to investigate. With Beck, Rangers J.H. Huffman and William Welch would actually hike into Ape Canyon. First, Beck would show them where he supposedly shot the first ape, knocking it into the canyon below. Of course, one of the rangers would descend into the canyon, and he'd find nothing there. Then they'd continue to the prospector's cabin, where Beck would point out the stones that had been thrown at them, although the rangers had the opinion that due to the lack of impression on the ground, these stones were probably placed on the ground by humans. So what about the large footprint in prints on the ground around the cabin? Well, remember how I said those toes of those apes were short and stubby? Yeah, well, according to the ranger, in his opinion, he'd say to an Oregonian reporter that Beck created these himself by stepping hard into the ground and then pressing hard with his hand, using the knuckles of his hand to form the impression of a toe. All of this said, the rangers didn't refuse that similar tracks had been seen in the areas for years, and admittedly, I do tend to get a little bit suspicious of anyone in this world that seems to have an answer for everything like these rangers. That said, I think they might have been onto something here. And finally, to wrap this saga up, the newspaper ends with an interesting hook. These prospectors, you see, apparently despite their near-death experience, took an interest in their assailants, because the last thing the article notes is that this group was building a new cabin, one close to a cave that was rumored to be home to these ape-like creatures. Sometimes I think to myself, gosh, this weird folklore series is so mainstream sometimes. UFOs, Bigfoot, who am I becoming? And then I see an article about a mystery soda machine, and the next thing you know, I'm like 40 pages deep into reading lore about a Coca-Cola dispenser. And I smile, knowing that I'm still a proper weirdo. So, yes, you heard that right. In Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, there is, of all things, a soda machine with a conspiracy attached to it. A vintage and sun-faded Coca-Cola machine that is far more mysterious than a soda machine has any business being, if you ask me. As for the story of this old pop machine, admittedly, I think that probably only one person knows its true history. But as far as the public knows, the machine appeared sometime in the late 1990s, sitting unassumingly at the corner of John Street and 10th Avenue. And while it did have buttons indicating it would dispense run-of-the-mill beverages, you know, Coke, Mountain Dew, Barks Root Beer, and such, it also originally had one single button marked Mystery. And if you pressed that button, well, it wasn't joking. Rather, it would dispense drinks of unusual flavors, and sometimes even discontinued beverages like Mountain Dew Whiteout, Lemon Lime Slice, Mountain Dew Code Red, and even Diet Hubba Bubba Bubblegum. Originally, it did all of this for just 55 cents too. Quickly, this strange machine, on the property of an old locksmith shop, would not just become the place to grab a quick, cheap, soft drink, but it also became a local oddity. And the fact that the locksmith shop swore up and down they knew nothing about it, despite it being powered by their electricity, was just the icing on the cake. Eventually, the machine itself fully leaned into this oddity too, replacing all of its buttons with mystery buttons, and dispensing a different soda with every button. Now, over time, there were some updates on this machine. For instance, in 2014, some photos were caught of mystery individuals restocking it, and in 2015, a spokeswoman mentioned to the Seattle Times that there were no permits available for the machine, and like all things, its price inflated to a whopping $1 in 2018. But then, something else would happen. In the midst of some maintenance work being done to a nearby bus stop and sidewalk, the machine went missing. And in its place, there was a note that read, "Went for a walk," with it parroting this message on its Facebook page. That said, all signs pointed to this machine's return. The Facebook page regarding this strange machine would see posts of this machine in various places, by the Space Needle, near the Eagle sculpture, and more. And sure enough, in October of 2022, the so-called mystery machine popped up again briefly at 17503 8th Avenue Northeast in Shoreline, Washington, at the corner of 175th 25th and 8th Avenue. That said, as of December 2022, the machine has gone missing again, and as recently as August 23rd, the locksmith, whose property it originally called home, has stated they don't know a thing about its whereabouts. So, as of now, there's no mystery soda machine, but I would be very surprised if it didn't find its way back to a street corner in Washington sometime in the future. Anyhow, let me know if you bought something from this machine. What soda did it spit out? Across the world, there's a theme that is honestly relatively common: stories of deep holes that existed before modern men stepped foot on the land where they exist. Holes that you could supposedly extend thousands or tens of thousands of feet of, let's say, weighted fishing line into, and you would never strike the bottom. The story of Mel's Hole is one of these strange tales. This story begins not with a dramatic saga necessarily, but with a humble radio show named Coast to Coast AM. Coast to Coast AM was a popular radio broadcast that largely centered itself, much like this channel, around paranormal stories, oddities, and conspiracy theories, and it was hosted by a man named Art Bell from 1998 to 2003. And even today it's ongoing with a new host. Seriously, you can tune in from 1 to 5 a.m. Eastern Time, and even today it's supposedly the most popular overnight radio show in the country. It would be part of this broadcast that on February 21st of 1997, like many nights, Art would get a call from someone wishing to share their paranormal story with him. But this one was more interesting and unique than usual. The man who called in referred to himself as Mel Waters, and Waters claimed he owned some property in Ellensburg, Washington, on the Monastash Ridge. And on this property, preceding his ownership and even that of the past tenants, there was a deep, deep hole, sort of a well. According to Mel, for as long as locals could remember, this hole just existed on what was now his property, and while nothing particularly dramatic occurred surrounding it, they used it as a dumping ground. People would toss in old furniture, they'd toss their trash in it, and in one case, even a deceased pet was thrown in, something we'll get to. And whatever you dumped, no matter how long you sat around waiting to hear it smack the bottom, well, you just never did. Mel, of course, wasn't just the recipient of these stories, he also had a few of his own. See, Mel, being an enterprising man, would throw about a pound of lead weight on the end of fishing line, and he would reel it into the hole. I hope he was sitting in a chair because, according to him, he ended up using multiple spools and ultimately lowered about 80,000 feet of fishing line into this hole. He was claiming that this hole was deeper, at least, than Mount Everest was tall multiple times over. And for the record, I did the math on this, and depending on what type of line you're using, this might have been as much as 80 pounds of fishing line on its own, dangling down into that hole. And perhaps even stranger, at this depth, the temperature would be hundreds of degrees. I think over 500 Fahrenheit, or at least over 260 degrees Celsius, which you'd think would probably make short work of that fishing line under normal circumstances. Beyond this, pets and local wildlife refused to go near this hole, and when Mel approached it once with a radio, presumably for entertainment as he reeled 80,000 feet of fishing line into it, it would turn to static most of the time. But, according to Mel, on one occasion he managed to catch a broadcast of a sporting event that was a baseball game that was played in the 1960s. Something that makes you wonder exactly what this hole was, and something that I'm not even sure fringe science has an identity for if it's real. Heck, one day, as noted, a neighbor would actually toss his deceased dog into the hole, not feeling like burying it, and just days later he'd actually be wandering on his property, and lo and behold, there was his dog. It had the same markings and the same collar that he tossed him into the hole with on. Everything. That said, when he beckoned the dog, it showed no interest in him, and it just walked away. Now, I'm not saying this wasn't his dog, but if true, this does make me wonder if it wasn't his dog. Anyhow, this story about Mel's Hole would develop over the course of multiple phone calls to Coast AM. But down the line following these calls, it seems that Bell attracted the attention of someone that he would have been better off avoiding. avoiding. And that someone, of course, was old Uncle Sam. One day, you see, Bell would return home from whatever he was doing, only to find his driveway was cordoned off by government officials that claimed that Bell may not even enter his own property, as, despite the fact that there was no smoke and no local hustle and bustle over a crashed plane, these operatives claimed that there was in fact a plane that crashed conveniently on his property. The government officials in the coming days would claim they were launching recovery efforts, and over time they'd essentially just say, "We're not leaving this land, but what we will do is give you $3 million a year to lease this land from you." The government officials in the coming days would claim that they were launching recovery efforts, and over time they'd essentially just say, "We're not leaving this land, but what we will do is give you $3 million a year to lease this land from you on the condition that you sign an NDA and leave the dang country." Now, don't get me wrong, I love American folklore, but for $3 million a year, I might just rename this channel T Explores Every Other Bottomless Hole in the Entire World, and wave goodbye from one of those fancy reclining plane seats that you can sleep in as I flew with a smile on my face to my new cottage in Majorca. That said, while Waters initially accepted this deal and moved to Australia to research alternative medicines to treat his terminal cancer he had, yes, he had terminal cancer, he didn't stay gone for long. One day he'd get on a plane and return to the United States, but as he was en route to Ellensburg, his bus would break down, and while the bus company would arrange for him alternative transportation, the next thing he knew, rather than boarding this bus, he'd actually wake up in San Francisco, missing teeth and with needle marks in his arm, 12 days later. Further, all that money that the US government had given him, it was pulled from his bank account. Now, this would have stopped most people, but Waters, you see, was a man loaded with ambition according to the stories. Others also had heard Waters' story through the radio show, and this led a Native American tribesman in New Mexico to reach out to him and let him know that on some of their land, they too had a very interesting hole. Mel, of course, devoting what little remained of his life to his fascination with bottomless pits, would travel out there, and similar to his hole in Washington, he would conduct a number of experiments. To begin, they started with the old tried-and-true fishing line test, and once again, this hole was a number of Mount Everests deep. They then lowered some ice into the hole, thinking further down it might be hot and melt the ice, as its rims were rather warm. But when the bucket with ice came back up, it was no longer ice, but rather some form of salt, which they managed to light on fire, and which supposedly burned for weeks afterwards. Then they even contemplated lowering a human inside, which I don't want to be macabre, but if I were in this situation, I might honestly be like, "Homies, send me down there, and let my wife know that I love her as much as chicken nuggies." But in this situation, folks had leveler heads than I, and chose to send a sheep down instead. Now, this poor sheep would resist, and it didn't even want to get close to the hole before it could see it. That said, they didn't give it a choice. They harnessed it up, and they lowered it down. Now, for the first few minutes, it struggled, but then there was silence and stillness. The sheep, which was packaged inside of a box, was completely still. After dropping it to a few thousand feet inside of this hole, and then bringing it back up, it was, as you might expect, deceased. And the box it was inside of was still sealed. Thus, I mean, when you send something possibly literally down to hell, you've got to cut it open afterwards, and they do just that, performing a little sheep autopsy on the poor creature. Now, to start, they found something pretty disturbing. The sheep was essentially cooked, which, to be clear, remember what I noted about temperatures at those deep depths. You could cook a deep dish pizza down there, as depending on how deep they lowered it, it realistically in life could have been like 750 Fahrenheit down there. That said, this wasn't all they found. According to them, during the autopsy, they also observed something was kind of wiggling inside of the sheep, and then they found and cut open some sort of sack to reveal some sort of seal-like fetus-looking thing, something that looked semi-human but also semi-aquatic, and the creature appeared to sort of reach out towards the hole. For the record, this was the only animal they'd seen want to approach the hole. Mel, in interviews, seemed sort of unsure why he'd do this, but he felt compelled to lift it up and carry it to the hole's edge, after which the small creature would dive inside, never to be seen again. And the most amazing part of this saga? See, weeks later, Mel would go in for another routine doctor's visit to see how he was doing and how his disease was progressing. And the news was surprising. Not only had the cancer not progressed, but according to Mel, he was in complete remission. And that, my friends, was the last thing we really ever heard from Mel. He stopped calling in to Coast in 2002, and at this point it's possible he passed away due to old age, as at the start of this saga in 1998 he wasn't a young whippersnapper. So with that, let's ask some questions. 1, do you think Mel and his hole were legitimate? And 2, if it was real, where might this hole be? Now to start, regarding Mel, I listened to hours of his interviews, and here are some things I noticed. Number 1, he was insistent in interviews that he was nervous about getting attention, but, he kept calling in, which is interesting. Further, Mel had a notable stutter when Art would interrupt him to ask him questions, or when he'd ask for details about individuals involved in the case other than him. Also, I'd look high and low for any evidence of a Mel Waters, and neither I nor others online who have tried to identify him could find any record of a Mel Waters in Ellensburg or the surrounding municipalities. Now, Art Bell did claim he sent a media crew to Ellensburg to look for this hole, and they did notice there was a suspiciously large military presence there, which I guess is weird, or maybe related to the Yakima Vagabond Army airfield 20 miles south, but otherwise they never saw the hole, and they never met Mel Waters. So in short, I don't know if Mel existed, plain and simple. Regardless, to humor this a bit more, outside of Mel, what about that hole in the ground? If it was real, where could it be? For starters, on screen is one candidate folks have pointed out on forums. This is a hole that's been available on satellite imagery ever since it was available to the public in 1998 or so, and it's just a bit north of Ellensburg. That said, I've looked at a lot of dried up springs on satellite imagery in my time digging through weird stuff, and that looks an awful lot like a dried up spring. Otherwise, Mel did give us a clue. In his last interview, he stated that the hole was on the Monastash Ridge south of Ellensburg, or about 5 or so kilometers southwest of the city. And with this in mind, folks have identified this weird spot. See, regardless of who you're using for satellite imagery, this whole block around these coordinates shown on screen looks weird. The edges are sort of blurred, and it almost appears like the satellite imagery here is fabricated, and there's a bit of discoloration going on. Anyhow, as always, I would love to know what you think. For me, I love the idea that there are these weird, strange holes that lead to possibly scary places, and when we eventually cover international folklore, I'll have quite a few stories about this sort of thing for you. But for now, until we have more evidence, I think Mel's story might have more bottomless holes in it than the state of Washington. In my Oregon video last year, I covered in depth the story of the legendary D.B. Cooper, a heist that, in my humble opinion, may be the greatest heist in American history, and one I'll probably devote an entire multi-hour video to someday, if I ever find the time or get my voice back. That said, despite Cooper's legendary status, this may surprise some of you, but D.B. Cooper isn't the only D.B. in the Pacific Northwest. He actually shares that moniker with another incredible heist, one that is perhaps equally unhinged, nearly as ambitious, and sadly a little less unsolved. But still, it's a story that you'd have to be a real Scrooge to not find entertaining. This story begins on September 30th of 2008 in Monroe, Washington. Several days before the heist, an innocuous Craigslist ad appeared titled "Laborers with Landscaping Experience Wanted for a Job in Monroe," and anyone who responded and agreed to the conditions was given a very specific set of instructions. They were to show up wearing the exact same outfit: work boots, glasses, jeans, a blue hat, a long-sleeved blue shirt, a fluorescent safety vest, and of course a protective particle mask, and it paid a very respectable $28.50 an hour. The workers were instructed to meet near the Bank of America branch at 19917 Old Owen Road at exactly 11 a.m. on September 30th. And sure enough, about a dozen people showed up on time, dressed identically, and ready to work. Of course, for this job, another man who had not received this email also showed up, and he was dressed exactly like the others, blended in perfectly, and raised no suspicion whatsoever. Some of the landscapers, being seasoned workers, actually already began doing some light work while they waited, and records showed they were already starting to wonder when their boss was going to arrive, and that question was answered, in a way at least, at about 11:05 a.m. See, at this time, a Brinks armored truck pulled up. A security guard stepped out, and he grabbed 2 bags of cash, and then he shut the truck behind him and began walking towards the bank. And that's when it happened. One of the identically dressed men dropped the pump sprayer he'd been holding, rushed the guard, and sprayed him directly with bear spray. Then he grabbed the money bags and took off running. The entire crime took only seconds. The robber sprinted roughly 100 yards away, crossed Old Owen Road, and headed straight for Woods Creek. And as he ran, he ditched parts of his disguise: his particle mask, a wig, his hat, and even a pair of shorts. A couple of people briefly gave him chase, but they lost him before he reached the woods. And once there, the robber hopped into a yellow inner tube, already stashed along the creek, along with the cash, and he floated downstream. The tube would later be found about 200 yards away. That day, the man who would soon be dubbed DB Tuber, a nickname that feels almost mandatory given how ridiculous this was, escaped with about $400,000. In the immediate aftermath, the details began to unravel. The landscapers, understandably, realized they had been scammed, and made that very clear to the police when they arrived on scene. Naturally, these workers quickly became persons of interest, and they all pointed investigators to the same thing: a Craigslist job posting advertising a city beautification project for Monroe. Even though the listing required they all buy their own gear, this was 2008, in the middle of a recession, and a nearly $29 an hour job was absolutely not chump change. So it's no wonder the perpetrator had no trouble recruiting willing participants. Investigators then followed the robber's escape route to Woods Creek, a shallow stream. Afterwards, it took them over an hour to locate the inner tube floating downstream, and along the way they recovered a radio, a shirt, and a steel cable the perpetrator had used to climb out of the creek. And beyond that, they had very little. The suspect was described only as a tall white man, and DNA taken from the discarded particle mask led nowhere. He wasn't in any criminal database. Okay, quick break from the story for my personal opinion. I completely understand why this guy earned the nickname DB Tuber. Compared to many bank robberies, this was relatively non-violent, and the inner tube used to escape is at least as unique as Cooper's parachute jump over the Pacific Northwest. And the whole hire a dozen people who look exactly like you strategy is completely ingenious, if not ripped straight from the plot of The Thomas Crown Affair from 1999. Don't get me wrong though, I'm not admiring the guy. He maced someone who was just doing their job and caused a massive disruption, but I can understand why people in the region found the whole affair wildly entertaining. Nobody was seriously hurt after all, and I do have to wonder if the perpetrator had just been maybe a little bit more careful with the evidence he left behind, and maybe his behavior before and afterwards, maybe he would have gotten away with it. But he wouldn't be so lucky. See, about a month after the robbery, a homeless man came forward with a crucial tip. He told police that several weeks before the heist, he saw a man pull into the Bank of America parking lot and retrieve a disguise from behind a trash bin. Given this was suspicious, the man wrote down the vehicle's license plate. This plate number led investigators directly to Anthony Curcio, the man responsible for the robbery, who had apparently been conducting a dry run of the heist. Police surveillance soon followed. After Curcio returned from a trip to Las Vegas, officers collected his DNA from a discarded water bottle that he threw away at a gas station. The sample matched the DNA recovered from the particle mask. The FBI would ultimately recover $220,000 of stolen money. None of the landscapers were charged, and Curcio was sentenced to 72 months in prison. While incarcerated, Curcio wrote a book titled Heist and High, detailing the entire ordeal, including his brutal time in solitary confinement, where he claimed he was beaten and, somehow worse, covered in cockroaches. And in the years since, Curcio has attributed his actions to substance abuse and addiction. After his release, on April 4th of 2013, he began working with young people, claiming he wanted to help steer kids away from addiction and poor decision-making. So, all things considered, this isn't much of a mystery at this point, but it is one heck of a saga. And while I can't condone a crime like this, even if it is entertaining as all get out, it did seem for a while like Curcio had made a genuine turnaround. But wait, in August of 2024, he and another man were charged with wire fraud related to trading cards. I guess DB Tuber is still at it. Washington. It's home to strange soda machines, Sasquatch sightings, and a suspicious number of extraterrestrial visitors, but it's also, somewhat unexpectedly, a place known for a handful of curses. And today, I thought I'd share a couple of the more notable ones that I came across researching for this video. First up, the curse of Jake Bird. Now, Jake Bird was not your typical curse-throwing individual. Usually, at least in semi-modern times, curses tend to be associated with deeply spiritual people or cultures with strong mystical traditions. Jake was not one of those. He wasn't a gypsy. He wasn't a voodoo practitioner. He wasn't dabbling in the occult. He was instead a man who had a pretty rough childhood and grew into a drifter as an adult, working as a railroad laborer, a farmhand, and occasionally a criminal. And by occasionally, I mean he'd been arrested many times for theft, assault, and other crimes. And to be precise, by the time this story takes place, Jake Bird had spent roughly 31 of his 45 years behind bars across multiple states. I don't know if that number is actually true, but I read it in like 3 different sources, and so I'm led to believe it might be true, but take that with a grain of salt. That said, Jake would ultimately become known for something far worse. In October of 1947, Bird would attack one Bertha Cludd, a resident of Tacoma, Washington, using an axe during a robbery. That crime would also link him to several other violent attacks in the region. After this incident, Jake didn't really evade capture for long. In fact, he barely left the scene of the crime before police arrived. He was quickly arrested and confessed to the attack that he had committed. On November 26th of 1947, Bird was found guilty, and his punishment would be permanent, if you catch my drift. And to give you an idea of just how bad this man was and how the court proceedings went, even his own defense attorney pretty much openly stated to the world that it would be better off without him. Now, after the conviction and sentencing were announced, Bird was allowed to make a statement, which is interesting, and instead of remorse, he'd deliver what sounded like a threat, or perhaps a premonition. He said, I quote, "I was given no chance to defend myself. My own lawyers just asked you to hang me. They apologized for defending me. If they were so reluctant to defend me, why did they contest the prosecutor's proof of murder, and now say that everything is proven?" And then he followed with this: "All you guys who had anything to do with this case are going to pass before I do." And just like that, the Jake Bird Hex was born. And plenty of people, let's be clear, they make bold claims. And if this had been the end of it, Jake Bird probably would have gone down as just another brutal criminal in Washington's true crime history. But it didn't end there. Instead, on January 1st of 1948, the judge who oversaw Bird's case passed away suddenly. Then on April 5th, the county sheriff passed away. On June 11th, the county court reporter died. On October 28th, the police detective lieutenant associated with the case passed away. And finally, perhaps poetically, Bird's own defense attorney passed away as well. These people weren't old either. Most of them were either 46 years old or in their 70s. Less commonly mentioned, too, is that a prison guard connected to Bird's incarceration also passed away during this period. Jake Bird himself would ultimately be executed on July 15th of 1949 at about 12:20 a.m., and he was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. And that is curse number 1. But it wasn't done there. See, it's not every day you find 2 notable curses tied to the same state, and I wanted to make the most of it. That said, this second curse is very different. Now, when most people think of Washington, they usually picture the western half: mountains, rain, evergreen forests, and sprawling cities. But I would be remiss if I didn't take a detour into some Spokane folklore. And that brings us to Jimmy Marks. Jimmy referred to himself as the senator of Spokane's Gypsy community. He was part of a large 20th century migration of Romanian Roma families into the United States, many of whom fled Europe to escape persecution. And Jimmy himself was born into a Roma family in a camp near Boise, Idaho. Now, to be fair, the Roma people have historically faced, and still face, serious discrimination and stereotyping, but from just about every account I can find, Jimmy Marks was not exactly helping the situation. Most descriptions of him paint a picture of someone who was obnoxious, hateful, and often outright cruel. Whether it was mocking people who suffered assaults, inserting himself into tragedies, or making public spectacles of funerals, he seemed to thrive on it. And just to really complete the resume, he was also a used car salesman. Jimmy Marks, you see, became nationally known in 1986 when police raided his home while investigating stolen property. And boy, did they find things. Authorities discovered over $1.6 million in cash and roughly $160,000 in jewelry. However, and this is important, the raids were conducted illegally. Police searched the homes of more than 20 of Jimmy's family members, even though only 4 of them were actually under investigation. It was a massive procedural failure. The family, of course, claimed the money was legally obtained and that they were essentially acting as a bank for other families. They then turned around and sued the city of Spokane for about $59 million, and the city ultimately paid them $1.4 million in a civil rights settlement. And in the aftermath of all of this, Jimmy Marks claimed he placed a curse on the city of Spokane, and he didn't let anyone forget it. See, anytime something bad happened in Spokane, whether it be sickness, an accident, a plane crash, a mining death, Jimmy blamed the curse. He would show up to city council meetings, specifically to remind officials that the curse was still active. And at one point, during his father's funeral procession, Jimmy had the hearse stop at City Hall, and then he opened the doors and invited his father's spirit to live inside of the Spokane City Hall forever, claiming that this was simply just part of the Gypsy curse package. I kid you not, I found enough documents that I think I could spend an hour listing all of the events that Jimmy claimed were tied to this curse. And to make matters worse, he would sometimes attend the funerals of unrelated victims and announce out loud to grieving families that the curse was the reason their loved one passed away. Buddy, I don't know what curse you're talking about, by the way. You walked away with $1.4 million for doing absolutely nothing. So, dear goodness, I would love to be cursed like that. So all of this said, in reality, it seems the only person who truly believed in the curse was Jimmy himself. His son, at least, certainly didn't. See, when Jimmy Marks died in 2007, his son Michael stated, "The curse, I think, is off Spokane. We appreciate everything that has been done, all of the cards and sympathy." And while bad things still do happen from time to time in Spokane, as they do literally everywhere, at least now there isn't some grade A menace showing up at city council meetings or funerals to yell about it. So in the end, I'm not entirely sure what's more folklore, the Gypsy curse of Spokane or Jimmy Marks himself. But one thing's for sure, people in Washington aren't likely to forget either anytime soon. Man, I know I talk about buried treasure in pretty much every state, but there's just something about a good lost treasure story. It fills you with intrigue, knowing that all across the United States, maybe just a few hundred feet off a hiking trail or something, you could be standing mere steps away from uncovering history, and possibly a small pile of untold riches. And Washington, like the other states we've talked about, has its fair share of buried treasure. Now, to be clear, there are many treasure stories in Washington, most of them passed down almost entirely through oral tradition. This one is sort of no different, and it comes out of a mining area near Blewett. The story centers on an old hermit miner named Thomas Douglas. According to legend, Douglas was originally from Scotland, and he wasn't just anyone. His father was an earl, and Thomas was the earl's oldest son. But he left Scotland after a falling out with his family after he secretly married a village girl named Jenny for love rather than marrying someone of high social standing. Thus, the stories say that Thomas and his wife set sail for the USA, where they were presumably going to live out their days. Except the next time we hear about Thomas, he arrives in Blewett, Washington in the 1890s, missing one wife from the journey, and that detail is never really explained. Now, at the time, Blewett was a rough-and-tumble sort of mining town. Miners streamed in along the highway that cut through town, they worked hard all day, and then they gambled it all away at night. The town revolved around a stamp mill and consisted of one hotel, 2 saloons, a post office, a general store, and a scattering of shacks where the miners lived. And Douglas, of course, took a mining claim there, but he worked it only occasionally. By most accounts, mining wasn't even how he made his living. It seemed more like a hobby, an excuse to stay in the area. He didn't appear to need the money. Accounts of Douglas say that he was grouchy, unhappy, and intensely solitary. He rarely socialized, and when he did leave town, it was usually to travel to Leavenworth, where he'd hop on a train headed to a destination that nobody could quite figure out. Then he'd return just a few days later, and he made these mysterious trips several times a year. That said, there were rare breaks in his loner routine, and those moments are where the legend really starts to take shape. Every so often, you see, Douglas would invite a few people into his cabin, and one of those gatherings in 1905 would become the foundation for the treasure story. Douglas, you see, had just returned from one of his unexplained train trips, and he invited some acquaintances over to play cards. And apparently, old Tom Douglas had a few too many Capri Suns that night, because at some point during the game, he lifted up his bunk bed and pulled out a trunk filled with gold coins, $5, $10, and $25 pieces, which he proceeded to use as poker chips. After the game, he calmly returned the gold to the trunk and slid it back under his bed. Now, the people present were referred to as friends, but that might be a generous term, and they later admitted they considered robbing him. And in the process of pondering this, they talked in front of other locals, which of course meant other people started talking too. And then, just days later, something else happened. One of Douglas's neighbors claimed that late at night, while feeding their infant child, they saw Douglas outside of his cabin burying a large wooden box about 100 yards away. And then later that night, a heavy snowfall hit the area and conveniently erased any visible sign of digging. At the time, the neighbor thought little of it. Douglas was already known to be strange, but then days passed, and nobody saw Douglas again. And eventually, someone performed what we might call a very late 1800s wellness check, and Douglas was found dead in his bunk bed. And then those same friends who had previously considered robbing him promptly arrived at his cabin to pay their respects. And by pay their respects, I mean they thoroughly searched the place for gold, and they found none. That said, word spread quickly. By spring, the area around Douglas's old cabin was reportedly riddled with holes as treasure hunters dug relentlessly for the missing gold. And even as the cabin deteriorated over time, people kept searching, hoping to uncover golden coins that would be worth thousands of dollars apiece today. Even now, Douglas's story circulates on the surprisingly large number of treasure hunting websites scattered across the internet. And as for what we can actually verify, Thomas Douglas, he seems like he was very real. He truly lived in Blewett, and he's still buried there. Records indicate he was born in 1850 in Perth, Scotland, and he passed away on March 18th of 1905 from a hemorrhage. He's buried in a cemetery near Culver Springs, sort of on the west side of Highway 97, west of Peshastin Creek. Further, Douglas likely did have money. Men like him, disgraced sons of wealthy families, were often known as remittance men that were supported by stipends from their families to keep them conveniently far away, and it's entirely possible his father provided him with annual payments. Further, there's documentation suggesting Douglas had a criminal past in Scotland. Court records reportedly describe him as a repeat offender, someone who narrowly avoided serious punishment and may have been given one final break by the government, which could explain why he left for America in the first place. And ultimately, as for the buried treasure, honestly, I'm not sure it existed. If you ask me, the poker chip gold story sounds a little creative, but Douglas was real, and the rumors didn't come from nowhere, so my best guess is that one day after a few drinks in a saloon or something, Douglas might have let it slip that he was the son of an earl, and from there the rumor mill did what it does best. Anyhow, whether there's a box of buried gold still sitting somewhere near Blewett, or whether this is just another case of frontier folklore growing legs over time, I'll leave that up to you. But I have to ask, have you heard this one before? And do you know anyone who's actively looking for this buried gold? Folks, I hope you enjoyed this journey through Washington's strangest stories, and don't worry, I'll be back to see you soon. You'll notice that a saga called the Oakville Blobs was missing here, and that's simply because it's crazy enough that I think it deserves its own video, so we'll be back soon for that. Further, if you're listening to this, my big boy job has probably calmed down a bit, meaning that I finally have some time to crank out a few more videos. Keep an eye out for a nice Christmas special or two, and further, for another weird folklore video coming soon. Otherwise, remember, we're aiming for 1 million subs here, and if you want to help me out, liking this video, subscribing, and commenting will help me reach that goal. And with that, I hope you good people of the Pacific Northwest are doing well, and whether you just saw a man floating down the river with bags full of cash, or if your dog dug a hole in your backyard and your radio is acting funny when you walk near it, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.